Long before there are emperors, dynasties, bronze armies, or written records, there is the river. It does not resemble the carefully controlled yellow river of later imagination, confined between engineered banks and mapped across modern provinces. It wanders, it divides, it abandons old channels and tears open new ones. After summer rains, its water thickens with suspended loess until it becomes the color of wet earth. Carrying enormous quantities of sediment eastward across the North China Plain, villages rise near it because the river offers fertile ground, water, fish, reeds, and transportation. Yet the same landscape can erase a settlement almost as easily as it creates one. To live here is to accept a difficult bargain. Abundance and danger occupy the same ground. Around 8,000 years ago, communities are already establishing increasingly permanent settlements across the wider Yellow River basin. These are not cities, and they are not yet states, but something important is happening. Families cultivate millet, especially foxtail and broomcorn millet, crops well suited to the relatively dry climate of northern China. They keep pigs and dogs, gather wild plants, hunt deer and other animals, make pottery, grind grain on stone tools, and build houses partly sunk into the earth. What survives in the archaeological record suggests societies still rooted in village life. Yet these villages are becoming more stable, more productive, and more socially organized than the mobile communities that came before them. One of the most famous early traditions is associated with sites archaeologists call the Yangshao culture, flourishing across large parts of the Middle Yellow River region from roughly the 5th into the 3rd millennium BCE. At places such as Banpo, near modern Xi'an, the traces of daily life are surprisingly vivid. Circular and rectangular houses cluster within a settlement. Storage pits sink into the ground. Kilns stand apart from living areas. Burials lie beyond the main residential space. Potters produce painted vessels decorated with geometric patterns, human faces, fish, and other forms whose meanings are mostly lost. Some graves contain more goods than others, but the spectacular hierarchy of later Bronze Age society has not yet fully appeared. The landscape around these communities is not simply an early version of modern northern China. Climate patterns shift over thousands of years, and some periods are warmer or wetter than today. Forest and grassland boundaries move. River courses change repeatedly. Wildlife once found across the region includes species now associated with very different environments. Archaeological remains from ancient China preserve evidence of elephants, rhinoceroses, and other animals that seem almost out of place in the later historical landscape. The world in which these early farmers live is therefore not only culturally distant but ecologically different. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The importance of millet is easy to underestimate. A grain seed is not dramatic compared with a palace foundation or a bronze vessel, but agriculture changes almost everything around it. A reliable field can support more people than a landscape dependent entirely on hunting and gathering. More people can remain in one place. Permanent houses become worthwhile. Storage becomes essential. Stored food creates opportunities for sharing, exchange, taxation, theft, inequality, and political control. None of these developments appear all at once, and farming does not automatically create civilization, but the foundations of later complexity are quietly accumulating. Other changes are visible in the organization of settlement itself. Some villages become larger than their neighbors. Defensive ditches and walls appear at certain sites. Specialized craftsmanship grows more sophisticated. Long-distance exchange moves unusual stones, shells, pigments, and valuable materials across considerable distances. Communities are no longer isolated dots scattered across the river basin. They're becoming parts of regional networks in which objects, technologies, marriage partners, rituals, and perhaps rivalries circulate between settlements. The Yellow River itself helps shape these connections while also making them unstable. Its famous tendency to flood comes partly from the extraordinary quantity of fine sediment it carries from the Loess Plateau. When deposited across the lower plain, that sediment gradually raises riverbeds and alters drainage patterns. In later historical periods, this process contributes to catastrophic changes of course, sometimes shifting the river hundreds of kilometers. Reconstructing its much earlier channels is difficult, and scholars still debate the precise relationship between environmental changes and the rise or abandonment of particular prehistoric settlements. The evidence remains incomplete because rivers destroy archaeological sites as effectively as they bury and preserve them. By the 4th millennium BCE, differences between regions are becoming more noticeable. Communities in the Middle Yellow River basin develop along their own trajectories while interacting with cultures farther east, west, north, and south. There is no single straight road leading toward what will later be called Chinese civilization. Instead, many societies are experimenting with agriculture, ritual, settlement planning, craft production, and social authority at the same time. Some prosper for centuries and then disappear, others influence neighboring groups. Ideas spread without necessarily bringing the people who first developed them. This matters because later histories often present civilization as though it begins with a named dynasty and a clear founding ruler. Archaeology reveals something less tidy. The institutions that eventually support states emerge slowly from countless earlier communities whose names are unknown. Their leaders leave no biographies. Their conflicts survive only as damaged skeletons, burned structures, fortifications, and abandoned settlements. Their beliefs appear indirectly in burials and ritual objects whose original meanings can only be partly reconstructed. By the late Neolithic period, however, the scale of change becomes harder to miss. Some settlements are no longer simply villages among equals. Larger centers begin to dominate surrounding landscapes. Walls grow thicker. Burials become more unequal. Workshops suggest increasing specialization. Valuable objects become concentrated in particular graves and buildings. Violence appears more clearly in human remains. The river basin is becoming crowded with communities that must cooperate, compete, defend territory, and organize labor on a larger scale. The first Chinese civilization does not suddenly rise from empty ground. It grows from this long, restless world of farmers, potters, hunters, builders, and river communities, generation after generation adapting to a landscape that never remains still. By the time the earliest palaces and bronze workshops appear, thousands of years of experimentation have already passed beneath the yellow earth. And before those palaces can emerge, the villages themselves must change. Across the Yellow River basin, the transformation begins quietly enough that no single generation would recognize it as the beginning of something entirely new. A village grows larger, another adds a ditch, a cluster of houses becomes more tightly organized. A burial contains objects that neighboring graves do not. A pottery workshop begins producing vessels in greater numbers than one household could ever need. None of these changes alone creates a state. Yet together they reveal a world in which some communities are acquiring more people, more resources, and more influence than others. The old village landscape is becoming uneven. By the later Neolithic, settlement patterns suggest that certain centres are drawing surrounding populations into their orbit. Smaller communities remain scattered across the countryside, but some large settlements occupy strategic positions near fertile land, waterways, or regional routes. These centres may have coordinated agricultural production, ritual gatherings, trade, defence, and craft activity over wider territories. Archaeologists cannot always determine exactly how authority worked within them, because no written records explain who gave orders or why others obeyed. What survives in the record suggests increasing coordination, but the structure of leadership remains partly hidden. Agriculture helps drive this transformation. Millet farming has already supported generations of permanent settlement, yet agricultural life is becoming more intensive. Fields must be cleared and maintained, harvests gathered at the correct moment, grain dried and stored, and surplus protected from pests, fire, and theft. Pigs remain important domestic animals, and livestock contributes not only food, but also a form of stored wealth. Communities that can manage reliable surpluses are better able to support people who are not working directly in the fields. Potters, stoneworkers, builders, ritual specialists, guards, and eventually metal workers can spend more of their time on specialized tasks. The consequences are visible in objects. Pottery becomes increasingly varied in form and quality. Some vessels are ordinary tools for cooking or storage, while others demand extraordinary skill. In several regions, delicate ceramics seem designed less for rough daily use than for display, ceremony, or elite consumption. Craftsmanship becomes a marker of distinction. Producing a difficult object requires knowledge, time, fuel, raw materials, and sometimes access to specialized workshops. Whoever controls those resources controls more than beautiful pottery. They control networks of labor and expertise. One of the most striking developments appears in the construction of defensive works. Rammed earth walls begin surrounding important settlements. The technique is deceptively simple, but labor-intensive. Layers of earth are placed inside wooden frameworks and repeatedly pounded until they form a dense, durable mass. Building a substantial wall requires coordinated crews, planning, tools, food supplies, and leadership capable of mobilizing labor beyond a single household. Walls, therefore, reveal both fear and organization. Communities have something worth protecting, and someone has the authority to organize that protection. The danger behind these defenses is not imaginary. Archaeological evidence from parts of Neolithic China includes individuals who suffered violent deaths, mass burials, damaged settlements, and signs that some communities were destroyed rather than peacefully abandoned. Warfare in this period is difficult to reconstruct precisely, and scholars still debate how frequent or organized it was. Yet the evidence makes clear that the emergence of complex society is not simply a story of cooperation. Growing populations compete for land, water, prestige, trade routes, and political dominance. At the same time, ritual becomes increasingly important as a way to bind communities together and distinguish leaders from ordinary households. Burials offer some of the clearest clues. In relatively equal societies, grave goods may vary modestly. In more stratified communities, differences become dramatic. Certain individuals are buried with finely made pottery, ornaments, jade, or other valuable objects, while others receive little. The dead are beginning to advertise the structure of the living world. This does not necessarily mean that hereditary kings already exist. Wealth, ritual status, age, family position, or achievement might all influence burial treatment. Archaeologists must be cautious because funerary customs do not perfectly mirror social life. Still, when rich burials occur alongside large public works, specialized production, and settlement hierarchy, a broader pattern emerges. Authority is becoming more concentrated. Several regional cultures participate in this process, and this diversity is crucial. Early Chinese civilization does not develop from one isolated population that simply expands outward. Different centers contribute different technologies, symbols, agricultural practices, ritual traditions, and forms of social organization. Communities along the Middle Yellow River interact with societies to the east on the Shandong Peninsula, with groups farther north, and with increasingly complex cultures along the Yangtze and elsewhere. Objects and ideas travel between these regions over hundreds of kilometers. A lesser-known but important feature of this world is how much long-distance exchange appears to predate formal states. Rare stones, jade, shells, and specialized ceramics can move far from their geological sources. Such movement suggests networks maintained through trade, gift exchange, marriage alliances, migration, or ritual relationships. Valuable materials are powerful precisely because they are difficult to obtain. An ornament made from distant stone carries not only beauty but geography. It demonstrates access to connections beyond the horizon. As settlements grow, their internal layout also becomes more organized. Certain areas are reserved for houses, workshops, storage, cemeteries, or ritual activity. Streets and pathways become more deliberate. Some communities seem to distinguish elite spaces from ordinary neighborhoods. This spatial separation matters because power is beginning to take architectural form. The difference between ruler and farmer is no longer expressed only through possessions. It may be built directly into the settlement. Yet growth is unstable. Large centers can decline suddenly. Fields can fail. Rivers can shift. Political alliances can fracture. A successful settlement may attract enemies as easily as migrants. The archaeological record contains abandoned communities whose exact stories are impossible to reconstruct. No single explanation fully accounts for these repeated cycles of expansion and contraction. Environmental change matters, but so do conflict, trade, internal inequality, and regional competition. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the Yellow River world is therefore becoming increasingly crowded with ambitious centers. Some communities command substantial labor. Some protect themselves behind walls. Some produce objects of extraordinary refinement. Social differences become harder to ignore, and competition between settlements appears increasingly intense. The landscape is approaching a threshold where village leadership alone may no longer be sufficient. Out of this pressure emerges one of the most revealing faces of early Chinese prehistory, the Longshan world, a time of black pottery, fortified centers, deepening inequality, and evidence that the struggle for power is beginning to reshape entire regions. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, the Yellow River world has become more tense, more crowded, and more unequal. Across wide stretches of northern China, archaeologists find settlements surrounded by walls, cemeteries divided by status, workshops producing highly specialized goods, and traces of violence that suggest competition is no longer occasional. This is the world often associated with the Longshan period, a broad archaeological horizon rather than a single unified civilization. Its communities differ from region to region, but taken together they reveal a landscape moving closer to political systems capable of controlling territory, labor, and resources on a scale earlier villages rarely achieved. The change is visible first in settlement hierarchy. Some sites are clearly larger and more elaborate than surrounding communities. Instead of every village functioning as an independent center, clusters of smaller settlements appear to be organized around major fortified places. That pattern suggests regional authority, though the exact political structure remains uncertain. A dominant center may have been the seat of a hereditary elite, a ritual authority, a military coalition, or some combination of all three. Without written records, scholars still debate how formal these systems were, but the physical imbalance between settlements is difficult to ignore. Walls become one of the clearest symbols of this new order. At several Longshan period sites, communities invest enormous labor in rammed earth fortifications. Such structures are not built casually. Soil must be collected, transported, layered, compacted, and maintained. Hundreds or perhaps thousands of people may be required over long periods. Their construction implies coordination and leadership, but it also implies danger. A wall separates those inside from those outside. It announces that people expect attack, that valuable stores and populations need protection, and that neighboring communities may no longer be trusted. At some sites, violence appears in disturbing forms. Human remains are found in pits, sometimes disarticulated or showing injuries that may have occurred around the time of death. Certain skulls appear to have been treated in ways that suggest ritualized violence or display. These discoveries are difficult to interpret, and not every unusual burial is evidence of warfare or sacrifice. The evidence remains incomplete. But it strongly suggests that interpersonal and intergroup conflict had become an important part of life in some regions. At the same time, craftsmanship reaches extraordinary levels. Longshan black pottery is among the most famous examples. Some vessels have walls so thin that they are often described as eggshell pottery. Their surfaces are dark, polished, and technically demanding to produce. These are not ordinary cooking pots. They require precise control of clay preparation, shaping, firing, and oxygen conditions inside the kiln. The skill involved points towards specialist artisans, and the rarity of such vessels suggests they may have served elite or ceremonial purposes. That distinction matters because craft specialization often reveals the social structure hidden behind objects. A household can make basic pottery for itself. Producing exceptional ceramics in significant quantities requires trained specialists who need food and resources while they work. Someone must support them. Someone must obtain the raw materials, manage production, and decide where the finished goods go. The elegant vessel in a grave is therefore only the visible end of a much larger system of labor and control. Burial practices reinforce the impression of widening inequality. Some graves contain little, while others hold finely made objects, ornaments, and signs of status. Differences can appear not only in grave goods but in tomb size, placement, and treatment of the body. The contrast suggests that social rank is becoming more deeply embedded. Certain individuals or families possess access to wealth and ritual privilege that others do not. Whether these elites already resemble kings remains uncertain, but hierarchy is no longer subtle. Environmental pressure may have intensified competition. Toward the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, parts of China experience climatic changes that appear to include greater variability and, in some areas, cooler or drier conditions. The famous global climatic episode around 2200 BCE has been linked to social disruption in many regions, including parts of China. but the relationship is complex. It would be misleading to imagine a single drought suddenly destroying Longshan society everywhere. Different communities respond differently, and political instability, warfare, demographic shifts, and local environmental change may all have interacted. The Yellow River adds another layer of unpredictability. Its channels can migrate, floodplains can be buried under sediment, and farmland can be destroyed or renewed depending on circumstance. In a society already divided by status and competing for resources, a bad sequence of harvests or river disasters could have political consequences far beyond agriculture. A ruler who cannot protect grain stores, organize irrigation, secure trade, or defend territory may lose authority quickly. One lesser-known feature of the Longshan world is the extent to which regional centers seem to rise and fall rather than forming a simple progression toward empire. Some large fortified sites are abandoned, others decline sharply. Population appears to contract in certain regions while becoming concentrated elsewhere. This has led archaeologists to describe the end of the Longshan period in some areas as a time of profound reorganization, yet collapse is not the same as disappearance. People survive, move, merge with other communities, and carry technologies and traditions into new political settings. That movement is crucial. By around the beginning of the second millennium BCE, the landscape of northern China looks different. Some of the great Longshan centers have lost importance. Regional cultures are being reorganized, yet the skills developed during the previous centuries remain rammed earth construction, specialized pottery, long-distance exchange, social hierarchy, organized labor, and increasingly complex ritual systems. The ingredients of state formation have not vanished. They have been redistributed. This is where archaeology begins to reveal something more concentrated and more difficult to explain as simply an enlarged village. In the Yiluo River basin of what is now Henan province, a settlement begins to expand rapidly. It develops palatial compounds, planned roads, specialized bronze workshops, elite burials, and a level of organization unlike anything that had existed there before. The site is known today as Erlitou, and with it the question of where Chinese civilization truly begins becomes far more difficult. In the Yiluo Basin, where the Yi and Luo rivers cut through the plains of western Henan, something changes with unusual speed. A settlement that begins modestly expands into a center covering hundreds of hectares. Roads are laid out with deliberate order. Large buildings rise within defined compounds. Workshops concentrate highly skilled production. Burials reveal sharp differences in status. Materials arrive from far beyond the surrounding valley. By the standards of early 2nd millennium BCE northern China, Erlitou is not merely large, it is qualitatively different from the communities that preceded it, and that difference is why the site has become central to one of the most important debates in early Chinese history. Erlitou develops through several archaeological phases, beginning around the early 2nd millennium BCE and reaching its height before declining later in the same millennium. Its growth is not simply a matter of population. The settlement acquires an internal structure that suggests centralized planning. Broad roads intersect parts of the site. Major architectural compounds are enclosed and separated from surrounding areas. Workshops producing bronze, turquoise objects, pottery, and other specialized goods occupy controlled zones. This concentration of political, ceremonial, and industrial activity strongly suggests the presence of an elite, capable of directing labor and resources on a regional scale. The palatial compounds are especially important. Their foundations reveal large, carefully arranged buildings constructed on rammed earth platforms. Courtyards, gates, corridors, and halls create spaces that are fundamentally different from ordinary domestic architecture. These structures are not simply larger houses. They appear designed for ceremony, administration, elite residence, or some combination of these functions. The exact activities carried out inside them remain uncertain because wooden superstructures have long vanished, leaving mostly foundations and post holes. Even so, their scale and restricted layout indicate that certain people occupied spaces from which most of the population was excluded. That separation is one of the clearest signs that Erlitou represents a new political order. Earlier societies already possessed hierarchy, but here hierarchy becomes embedded in urban planning. Power is no longer visible only in burial goods or valuable objects. It shapes the arrangement of streets, compounds, workshops, and access routes. The settlement itself becomes an instrument for organizing people. Archaeologists have also uncovered evidence of sophisticated bronze production. Early bronze objects had appeared in China before Erlitou, but at this site metalworking becomes more systematic and politically significant. Workshops can contain remains associated with casting, including molds and production debris. The bronze vessels produced here are relatively modest compared with the enormous ritual bronzes of later Shang kings, yet they represent an important technological transition. Casting bronze requires control over copper, tin or other alloying materials, fuel, skilled craftspeople, and specialized knowledge. These resources do not naturally gather in one place. They must be assembled through networks of exchange and authority. One particularly striking Erlitou artifact is the turquoise-inlaid dragon-shaped object discovered in an elite burial. Made from thousands of small pieces of turquoise arranged into a long, sinuous form, it demonstrates both extraordinary craftsmanship and access to precious material. Its exact meaning is unknown. It may have been associated with ritual, rank, cosmological symbolism, or an early form of imagery that later becomes connected with dragons in Chinese culture. Scholars still debate how directly such symbols can be linked across many centuries, and it would be misleading to treat the object as proof of a fully developed later dragon tradition. What it clearly shows is that Erlitou elites invested heavily in objects designed to communicate identity and status. The settlement's influence extends well beyond its immediate surroundings. Erlitou-style ceramics and other material traits appear across a broad region, suggesting that the center participated in or dominated extensive exchange networks. Some archaeologists interpret this pattern as evidence of territorial expansion or political control. Others emphasize cultural influence rather than direct rule. The evidence remains incomplete because material similarity does not automatically indicate conquest. Pottery styles can spread through trade, imitation, migration, or elite alliances. Still, the geographical reach of Erlitou-related material is difficult to explain without assuming that the site held unusual regional importance. Its population also appears socially divided. Elite graves contain bronze objects, turquoise, jade, lacquer, and other prestigious goods, while many ordinary burials are far simpler. Some individuals are placed in carefully constructed graves within important areas of the settlement. Others receive little investment. The contrast suggests a society in which access to wealth and ritual privilege is tightly controlled. Yet the majority of people at Erlitou are not kings or nobles. They are farmers, labourers, potters, builders, metalworkers, hunters, servants, and specialists whose work sustains the elite centre. Food production therefore remains fundamental. Millet continues to play a major role, while wheat and rice are also present in varying amounts, reflecting expanding agricultural connections across China. Animals such as pigs, dogs, cattle, and sheep contribute meat, labor, or ritual value. Some crops and livestock ultimately have origins far beyond East Asia, reminding us that prehistoric China was never completely isolated. Wheat, sheep, and cattle entered through long-distance networks stretching across Eurasia over many generations. By the time Erlitou flourishes, these imported species have been absorbed into local economic systems. This is one of the more surprising aspects of early Chinese state formation. The society developing along the Yellow River is deeply local in its political traditions, but some of the resources it uses are products of much wider prehistoric connections. Bronze metallurgy itself may also have been influenced by technological ideas moving eastward through Inner Asia, though Chinese casting methods quickly developed distinctive characteristics. Rather than simply copying Western techniques, early Chinese metalworkers created a highly specialized tradition based heavily on piece mold casting. Erlitou therefore stands at a crossroads. It possesses palace architecture, craft specialization, regional influence, social hierarchy, organized planning, and bronze production. For many archaeologists, these features are enough to call it an early state and perhaps the earliest clearly urban political center in China. Yet one crucial thing is missing. There is no securely identified written archive telling us what Erlitou's inhabitants called themselves, who their rulers were, or what political system they believed they belonged to. And that silence opens the door to the most famous possibility of all, that beneath the foundations of Erlitou lies the archaeological world of the legendary Xia dynasty. At Erlitou, our power is not hidden, it is built into the ground. The broad roads cutting through the settlement, the rammed earth foundations beneath elite compounds, the controlled workshops, and the restricted ceremonial spaces all suggest a society in which authority has become physical. A visitor approaching the central district would have entered a landscape deliberately organized to distinguish ordinary life from the spaces of command. The difference between ruler and farmer is no longer merely social, it is architectural. Certain people occupy compounds with formal gates and large courtyards, while others live and work beyond them. Certain crafts are concentrated near the political center. Certain objects circulate only among the elite. The city is beginning to function as a machine for concentrating resources. This planning is one of the strongest reasons archaeologists treat Erlitou as something more than a prosperous settlement. Roads appear to define major zones within the urban core, and traces of walls or boundaries separate important compounds. The arrangement implies long-term decisions about movement and access. People cannot simply build wherever they please. Space itself has been allocated, which means some authority is powerful enough to impose order on the settlement. The large buildings raised on rammed earth platforms are especially revealing. Wood and thatch have mostly disappeared, but the foundations preserve their footprints. Some complexes contain broad courtyards surrounded by halls and subsidiary structures. These were places designed to hold groups of people, organize ceremonies, store valuable goods, or conduct political business. No surviving inscription explains their purpose. So scholars still debate whether the word palace is always appropriate. Yet whatever their exact function, these compounds required enormous quantities of labor and clearly belonged to people of exceptional status. The technology behind them is worth noticing. Rammed earth may appear crude beside later stone architecture, but it is remarkably effective. Earth is placed in layers inside temporary wooden frames, then compacted repeatedly until it forms a dense mass capable of supporting substantial structures. The method becomes one of the great construction traditions of ancient China, eventually used for city walls, palace foundations, and defensive works on a vast scale at Erlitou. It already allows political authority to reshape the landscape. The bronze workshops reveal another form of control. Bronze production is not simply a matter of melting metal in a household fire. Copper and alloying materials must be obtained, transported, prepared, and combined. Furnaces must reach suitable temperatures. Molds must be designed and assembled. Skilled workers need years of experience. Failed castings waste expensive material. Successful production, therefore, depends on organization as much as technology. At Erlitou, bronze casting appears closely tied to elite demand. Among the most distinctive objects are ritual vessels, weapons, bells, plaques, and tools. The vessels are smaller and technically less elaborate than those produced in a later Shang foundries, but their significance is already clear. Bronze is becoming a prestige material. It communicates access to distant resources and specialized labor. To possess it is to demonstrate that other people have mined, transported, refined, designed, cast, and finished an object on the owner's behalf. This is why bronze eventually becomes so closely connected with political authority in ancient China. Its value does not come only from the metal itself. It embodies an entire network of control. One of the most visually striking Erlitou objects is a bronze plaque decorated with pieces of turquoise arranged into an animal-like face. Similar turquoise workmanship appears in other elite contexts, including the long dragon-shaped object found in a rich burial. Turquoise had to be sourced from specific geological regions, transported over considerable distances, carefully cut, and fitted into elaborate designs. A single object could therefore combine several forms of specialized knowledge. Its owner was displaying not simply wealth, but the ability to command a chain of resources stretching far beyond the city. The road network provides another clue to how centralized this system may have been. Archaeologists have identified intersecting routes within the core area that appear to organize movement between major compounds and workshops. Some of these roads are surprisingly substantial for such an early settlement. Their presence suggests repeated traffic and deliberate maintenance. Carts may have moved along them, although evidence for transportation technology must be treated carefully. What is certain is that the urban centre was not an accidental cluster of buildings. Movement through it had been planned. The settlement also reveals signs of production beyond bronze. Pottery workshops supplied vessels for daily and ceremonial use. Bone and stone were worked into tools and ornaments. Turquoise specialists created elaborate inlays. Lacquer, although difficult to preserve archaeologically, appears in elite contexts and required its own demanding production process. Each specialized craft adds another layer to the economy surrounding the central elite. Yet the system depends overwhelmingly on people whose names will never be known. Farmers outside the ceremonial core produce food. Laborers quarry and carry earth. Woodworkers prepare beams and frames. Miners extract ore far from the settlement. Porters move raw materials. Potters manage kilns. Metalworkers tolerate extreme heat and toxic fumes. Craftsmen spend hours shaping tiny pieces of turquoise. Their combined labor makes elite splendor possible. This is one of the contradictions at the heart of early states. As societies become more organized, they can accomplish things no household or village could manage alone. Roads, monumental architecture, specialized workshops, long-distance exchange, and technically demanding art become possible. But these achievements also require the concentration of surplus and the unequal distribution of labor. The palace is impressive, partly because thousands of people do not live in one. Burials show how deep this division may have become. Some elite individuals are interred with bronze vessels, jade, turquoise ornaments, lacquerware, and objects associated with ritual authority. Ordinary graves tend to be much simpler. A small number of people possess goods whose production consumes extraordinary amounts of communal effort. At the same time, there is no evidence that Erlitou rulers commanded the gigantic armies or territorial bureaucracy associated with later Chinese empires. Calling the site a state does not mean imagining an emperor governing millions. Its political world was probably smaller, more fragile, and dependent on networks of alliance, tribute, ritual authority, and direct control over nearby communities. The precise boundaries of its influence remain uncertain. What survives nevertheless suggests something unprecedented in this region, a center capable of organizing urban space, monumental construction, elite ritual, long-distance resources, and specialized production within a single political system. And the most powerful symbol of that system may have been bronze itself. At Erlitou it is still rare, almost intimate. Confined to a small world of high-status objects. Within a few centuries, however, Chinese foundries will produce bronze vessels weighing hundreds of kilograms, covered in dense designs and cast for rulers who claim authority over much larger territories. Erlitou stands at the beginning of that transformation. But identifying who those rulers actually were leads archaeology into far more uncertain territory. Because later Chinese histories remember a dynasty that supposedly ruled before the Shang, and the dates appear tantalizingly close. Its name is Jie. The name Xia stands at the edge between archaeology and memory. In later Chinese historical tradition, the Jie dynasty comes before the Shang and is remembered as the first hereditary dynasty of ancient China, founded after a heroic age associated with flood control and the legendary figure Yu the Great. Yet the problem is immediate. The texts that describe the Xia in recognizable historical form were written many centuries after the period in which the dynasty is supposed to have existed. No securely identified inscription from Erlitou says Xia. No royal archive has been recovered naming its kings. No contemporary document settles the issue. What remains is a difficult overlap between later tradition and archaeological reality. This overlap is precisely why Erlitou has attracted so much attention. Its chronology roughly fits the period in which later sources place the Xia. Its location lies within the broader region associated with early dynastic traditions. Its scale, elite architecture, bronze production, and regional influence are entirely consistent with the kind of complex political society that might stand behind memories of an early dynasty. For many Chinese archaeologists, these converging clues make Erlitou a strong candidate for the material expression of Xia civilization. But strong candidate is not the same as confirmed identity. The later historical accounts are detailed enough to be compelling. They present lineages of rulers, successions, political crises, and eventual replacement by the Shang. Yet historians must ask how these traditions were transmitted before being written down. Oral memory can preserve important events for long periods, especially when tied to ritual genealogy and political legitimacy. It can also compress centuries, combine different rulers, relocate events, and reshape the past to explain the present. A dynasty remembered in later texts may preserve a genuine historical core, while still being very different from the society that actually existed. The story of Yu and the flood illustrates the difficulty. Later tradition presents Yu as the figure who succeeds in controlling catastrophic waters, not simply by blocking them, but by channeling them across the landscape. His success earns political legitimacy and eventually leads to dynastic rule. Flooding is certainly a real feature of early Chinese history, and geological studies have identified major flood events in parts of the Yellow River system during the broad period surrounding early state formation. One dramatic flood associated with a landslide-dammed lake at Jishi Gorge has attracted particular attention because researchers propose that its date could fit traditions surrounding a great flood and the rise of the Xia. The connection is intriguing, but it remains debated. A single geological disaster does not automatically explain a legendary narrative compiled much later. Dates have been reconsidered, interpretations vary, and the geographic relationship between flood evidence and political centers is complex. No single explanation fully accounts for the tradition. The existence of major floods makes stories of heroic water control plausible in a general sense, but it cannot by itself prove either Yu or the Xia dynasty. This distinction matters because early Chinese historiography became deeply concerned with legitimate succession. The Xia, Shang, and Zhou were eventually understood as a sequence of dynasties in which moral and political order could rise, decay, and pass to new rulers. Later Zhou thinkers developed ideas that would become associated with the mandate of heaven, explaining conquest not merely as military victory, but as the justified transfer of authority away from corrupt rulers. In such a framework, the past is never politically neutral. Earlier dynasties become examples. The Xia therefore serves an important role in later historical memory. It provides a beginning to hereditary dynastic rule. It establishes a precedent for the fall of a ruling house. It creates a deeper antiquity for political institutions already familiar to later writers. These functions do not mean the Xia was invented. They do mean the texts cannot simply be read as contemporary reports. Archaeology complicates the picture further because Erlitou itself changes over time. It grows, reorganizes, and eventually declines. At its height, the site possesses features expected of an early state, but its political territory cannot be mapped with confidence. Erlitou-style materials appear widely, yet archaeologists cannot always distinguish direct control from cultural influence. A settlement using similar pottery may have paid tribute to Erlitou, traded with it, imitated it, or simply belonged to a network in which elites shared prestigious styles. The question of ethnicity or identity is even more difficult. Modern labels such as Xia, Shang, or Chinese can create an illusion of clear cultural boundaries that probably did not exist in the same way in the early 2nd millennium BCE. People may have identified themselves through kin groups, settlements, ruling lineages, ritual communities, regional alliances, or categories that have left no direct trace. Applying a later dynastic name to all inhabitants of an archaeological culture risks making the past appear more unified than it was. There is also a broader issue. If Erlitou is Xia, then archaeology may be recovering one of the earliest dynastic states remembered in Chinese tradition. If it is not Xie, Erlitou remains historically extraordinary. Its significance does not depend on the label. It still represents a powerful early political centre with palatial architecture, bronze technology, elite hierarchy, and far-reaching influence. In other words, the archaeological evidence does not become less important simply because the name remains uncertain. This is sometimes lost in popular discussions, where the question is reduced to whether the Xia was real or legendary. The reality is more interesting. There clearly were complex societies in the Yellow River region during the period later associated with the Xia. There clearly were centers capable of organizing substantial labor and controlling prestigious technologies. What cannot yet be demonstrated is whether the people at Erlitou called their polity Xia, whether later king lists accurately preserved their rulers, or whether multiple political traditions were eventually compressed into a single dynastic story. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the evidence. It is part of what makes the period so compelling. Archaeology reveals buildings, workshops, roads, graves, and objects. Later texts preserve names, genealogies, and narratives. The two records approach one another closely, but they do not fully meet. And while historians continue to debate the shadow of Xia, the world around Erlitou is already changing. Climate variability intensifies in some regions, river systems remain unstable, and political competition does not disappear. The first state-like centers of the Yellow River are powerful, but they are not secure. Soon, the landscape itself and the ambitions of rival communities will test how durable this new political order really is. The Yellow River gives life, but it never promises stability. Across the plains and valleys where early states are taking shape, water remains both the foundation of agriculture and one of the greatest threats to political order. Fields depend on predictable rainfall and manageable river channels, yet neither is guaranteed. Floods can spread fertile silt across the land, but they can also destroy houses, bury farmland, isolate settlements, and redirect entire waterways. Drought can be just as damaging, reducing harvests and forcing communities to compete more fiercely for what remains. For the rulers of an early state such as Erlitou, environmental instability is therefore not merely a background condition, it becomes a test of authority. The Yellow River is especially dangerous because of the enormous amount of sediment it carries. Much of this sediment originates in the Loess Plateau, where fine, easily eroded soil can be washed into tributaries and then transported downstream. As silt accumulates, channels can become shallower and unstable. Floodwaters escape their banks, new courses open, and old ones are abandoned. Over long periods, this process repeatedly transforms the North China Plain. Later historical records describe the Yellow River changing course with devastating consequences, but similar processes operated long before written history. Reconstructing those earlier changes is difficult. Ancient river channels are buried beneath later deposits, agriculture, towns, and modern infrastructure. Archaeologists and geologists rely on sediment cores, stratigraphy, buried soils, paleo-channels, and the distribution of settlements to piece together what happened. Even then, the picture remains incomplete. A settlement may disappear because a river moved, because fields became less productive, because warfare intensified, or because political networks collapsed. Often several pressures operate together. Around the transition from the 3rd to the 2nd millennium BCE, parts of northern China experienced significant climatic variability. Some studies point to cooler or drier conditions in certain regions, while others emphasize abrupt local shifts rather than one uniform climate crisis. The period overlaps broadly with a global event often called the 4.2 kilo-year climatic episode, which has been linked to social disruption in areas from the eastern Mediterranean to South Asia. It is tempting to imagine a single climatic shock sweeping across the ancient world and bringing down societies everywhere. But the evidence is far more complicated. Different regions respond differently, and scholars still debate how strongly climate affected particular communities in China. For some settlements, however, the consequences of environmental stress may have been severe. Reduced rainfall can shrink crop yields. Flooding can destroy stored grain just as easily as drought can prevent grain from growing. A sequence of poor harvests does not need to wipe out a population to destabilize a political system. If elites depend on surplus food to support specialists, warriors, ritual activity, and large building projects, even a moderate decline in agricultural production can weaken the entire structure. This makes food storage critically important. Grain stored in pits or containers represents more than survival through winter. In a complex society, it is also political power. Whoever controls surplus can feed labor crews, support artisans, provision travelers, reward allies, and survive temporary shortages better than rivals. Storage therefore creates both resilience and inequality. During a crisis, communities with access to centralized reserves may endure, while those excluded from them may face hunger or displacement. Water management may also have become an important source of authority, although the scale of early hydraulic engineering is often exaggerated in popular accounts. Later traditions place enormous emphasis on flood control, especially in stories associated with Yu the Great. But there is little evidence for a single centralized project capable of mastering the entire Yellow River system in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Local communities were certainly capable of building ditches, embankments, drainage features, and other practical works, but controlling such a vast and unstable river would have been beyond the reach of any early state. The political importance of water may therefore lie less in conquering the river than in managing local risk. A ruler who can organize labor to repair flood damage, maintain fields, move grain, or resettle affected communities demonstrates useful authority. A ruler who repeatedly fails may lose prestige. In societies where political legitimacy is still fragile, environmental crisis can expose weaknesses that remain hidden during prosperous years. One dramatic discovery has intensified debate about the relationship between flooding and early Chinese state formation. Geological evidence from the upper Yellow River at Jishi Gorge indicates that a massive landslide once dammed the river, creating a temporary lake. When the natural dam failed, an extraordinary flood followed. Researchers propose that this event may have occurred around the early 2nd millennium BCE and suggested a possible connection with later traditions of a great flood before the rise of the Xia. The idea attracted enormous interest because it seemed to link geology with legend, yet caution is necessary. Dating the event precisely is difficult, and subsequent research has challenged aspects of the original chronology and interpretation. Even if a catastrophic flood occurred, there is no direct evidence connecting it to Yu, Erlitou, or a specific political transformation hundreds of kilometers away. The event demonstrates that extreme floods were possible, not that one flood created Chinese civilization. The same caution applies when explaining Erlitou's eventual decline. Environmental change may have contributed, but there is no clear layer showing the city suddenly destroyed by a flood or abandoned after one catastrophic drought. Instead, the settlement appears to lose importance as another political and cultural system expands. This suggests that climate and river instability may have acted as pressures rather than simple causes. Political systems rarely collapse for only one reason. Environmental stress can weaken agriculture. Weak harvests can reduce elite resources. Reduced resources can strain alliances. Rival centers can take advantage of instability. Populations may migrate towards safer or more prosperous areas. Craftspeople may move with them. Trade routes may shift. A city can decline without being physically destroyed. That pattern seems increasingly important in the world after Erlitou's peak. Regional competition intensifies, and a different kind of centre begins to emerge farther east. Its walls are larger. Its bronze industry is more ambitious. Its influence spreads through a network of settlements that increasingly resembles a powerful territorial state. The new centre is associated with the early Shang world, and one of its greatest cities lies beneath modern Zhengzhou. Farther east, on the broad plains around what is now Zhengzhou, another centre begins to grow, and compared with Erlitou it feels heavier, more fortified, and more openly concerned with control. The transition is not a clean replacement in which one civilization simply disappears and another steps into its place. Archaeological layers overlap, traditions persist, and populations almost certainly move between regions. Yet by the middle of the second millennium BCE, the political centre of gravity is shifting. A new network of settlements associated with the early Shang world begins to dominate parts of the Yellow River Basin, and Zhengzhou becomes one of its most powerful expressions. The scale of the site is immediately striking. Beneath and around the modern city lie the remains of an enormous Bronze Age settlement, including a massive rammed earth enclosure stretching for kilometers. The walls are far larger than anything needed to protect a small village. Their construction would have required a huge workforce, repeated deliveries of earth, organized food supplies, and sustained authority. Like the walls of earlier Longshan centers, they speak of danger. But here they also speak of state power. Whoever ordered them built could mobilize labor on a scale that few earlier communities could match. Inside and beyond the enclosure, archaeologists have identified foundations of large buildings, workshops, storage areas, burials, and zones of specialized production. The settlement does not appear to have grown randomly. Different activities are concentrated in particular areas, creating a structured urban landscape. Bronze foundries occupy specific zones. Bone workshops process animal remains into tools and objects. Potters operate kilns. Elite spaces stand apart from ordinary residential areas. Once again, control over space mirrors control over society, but the scale is now greater. Bronze production is especially important. At Erlitou, bronze had already become a marker of elite power, but early Shang metalworking expands dramatically. Foundries produce ritual vessels in increasingly complex shapes and larger sizes. Weapons also become more common, including axes and other objects associated with military or ceremonial authority. Casting techniques grow more sophisticated, relying on carefully prepared ceramic molds assembled in sections around a model. Molten metal is poured into the spaces between mold and core, allowing craftsmen to create vessels with intricate forms and raised decoration. This piece mold tradition becomes one of the defining technologies of Bronze Age China. Elsewhere in the ancient world, metalworkers often hammered sheets or used different casting techniques, but Shang foundries become exceptionally skilled at producing large, complex vessels in molds. The method demands precision. A mistake in the mold, temperature, alloy, or pouring process can ruin the entire object. Success requires coordinated teams of specialists rather than a single artisan working alone. The result is more than technical achievement. Ritual bronzes become central to elite identity. Vessels are used in ceremonies involving food, drink, and offerings to ancestors or powerful spiritual beings. The exact form of early Shang ritual is only partly visible before extensive writing appears. but later evidence suggests that communication with ancestors becomes deeply embedded in royal authority. Bronze vessels help materialize that relationship. They are expensive, durable, visually imposing, and restricted enough to reinforce the distance between rulers and ordinary households. This combination of metallurgy and ritual creates a powerful political language. A ruler who possesses dozens of bronze vessels is displaying control over mines, transport, workshops, fuel, craftsmen, and agricultural surplus. A ruler who uses them in ceremonies is also claiming access to supernatural legitimacy. Political authority and ritual authority reinforce one another. The Yangshao settlement also reveals the darker side of this system. Burials and pits contain human remains that may represent sacrifice, execution, or victims of violence. Later Shang sites make ritual killing unmistakably clear, and evidence from earlier phases suggests that the practice is already developing. Some victims may have been captives taken in warfare. Others could have occupied different dependent or marginal positions within Shang society. The exact identities are often impossible to recover, but their presence reminds us that monumental civilization can rest on coercion as well as cooperation. Animal sacrifice is also significant. Cattle, pigs, dogs, sheep, and other animals appear in ritual contexts. These animals are economic resources, yet they are deliberately removed from ordinary consumption and offered in ceremonies. Sacrifice, therefore, demonstrates abundance. Only a society producing substantial surplus can repeatedly destroy valuable food and livestock for ritual purposes. The act converts material wealth into spiritual and political prestige. The Shang expansion is visible beyond Yangshao, settlements sharing related ceramics, bronze styles, architectural practices, and ritual traditions appear across a broad area. Some may have been directly controlled by the same political center. Others may have been allied or subordinate states governed by local elites. Scholars still debate the exact structure of early Shang power. It may not have resembled a modern territorial state with fixed borders. Influence could have been strongest near central cities and weaker farther away, connected through kinship, tribute, warfare, and ritual allegiance. This loose but powerful network may help explain the rapid spread of Shang material culture. Military force matters, but conquest alone cannot account for every similarity. Local elites may adopt Shang-style bronzes because participation in the new ritual system brings prestige. Craftspeople may migrate between centers. Marriage alliances may connect ruling families. Technologies and symbols can spread faster than direct political administration. The relationship between Yangshao and Erlitou is especially revealing. Erlitou declines as early Shang centers expand, but there is no simple evidence for a single catastrophic invasion destroying the older city. Instead, some technologies and practices appear to continue across the transition. Bronze casting develops rather than being reinvented. Rammed construction persists. Elite ritual becomes more elaborate. This suggests that the Shang world inherits part of the political and technological foundation built by earlier societies, even if rulers change. That continuity makes the rise of Yangshao more significant, not less. Civilizations rarely begin from nothing. New regimes appropriate the skills, labor systems, agricultural networks, and symbolic traditions of those they replace. They reshape them, expand them, and present them as part of a new order. At Yangshao, that new order becomes visible in walls large enough to redefine the landscape and workshops capable of producing bronze on an unprecedented scale. Power is no longer concentrated only in a palace compound. It spreads through an entire urban industrial system. And within that system, bronze is becoming something more than a precious material. It is turning into one of the central instruments through which Shang rulers express hierarchy, ritual authority, military strength, and the right to command. Bronze changes the appearance of power along the Yellow River because it allows authority to become visible, durable, and almost theatrical without needing written explanation. A vessel can be carried into a ceremony, filled with food or drink, displayed before ancestors, buried with the dead, and passed between generations. Its weight alone announces wealth. Its surface announces skill. Its existence announces control. By the early Shang period, this combination makes bronze one of the clearest instruments through which political hierarchy is expressed, and the scale of production reveals that metallurgy has moved far beyond occasional experimentation. The process begins long before molten metal reaches a mold. Copper must be mined from ore deposits that may lie far from political centres. Tin or other alloying materials must also be obtained, though the exact composition of early bronzes varies. Ore must be transported, processed, smelted, refined, and distributed. Fuel must be gathered in enormous quantities. Clay must be prepared for moulds and furnace structures. Skilled craftspeople must understand how metal behaves at high temperatures and how different mixtures affect hardness, colour, and flow. None of this is easy, and almost none of it can be sustained without a dependable agricultural surplus feeding people whose labour is no longer devoted primarily to farming. This is why a bronze vessel is more than an object. It represents an invisible chain of people and resources. A ruler who controls bronze production controls access to miners, transport networks, foundries, workshops, food stores, and specialist knowledge. The political significance of metallurgy lies as much in that chain as in the finished artifact. Shang foundries become exceptionally sophisticated. Instead of relying primarily on hammering or simple open molds, artisans perfect piece mold casting. A model of the desired vessel is created, clay is applied around it, and the outer mold is divided into carefully fitted sections. A core forms the interior cavity. When everything is assembled, molten bronze is poured into the narrow space between core and mold. Once the metal cools, the mold is broken away. Each major casting is therefore the result of a one-use ceramic system built specifically for that object. The technique allows extraordinary control over shape and decoration. Raised flanges, complex handles, animal forms, and dense geometric patterns can be incorporated directly into the casting. Over time, decorative traditions become increasingly elaborate, including the famous symmetrical animal mask motifs later called taoti. Their original meanings are not securely known. They may have carried ritual, ancestral, protective, cosmological, or status-related significance, and scholars still debate how they were understood by Shang users. What is clear is that such imagery becomes inseparable from elite ceremonial culture. The vessels themselves take many forms, each adapted to particular functions. Some hold food, others heat or serve liquids. Tripod vessels stand on 3 legs above a fire. Tall cups and pouring vessels appear in drinking rituals. The exact ceremonies change over time, but repeated deposition of bronze vessels in elite graves indicates that they remain important even after death. The dead are equipped with objects associated with status and ritual participation, suggesting the political and ancestral identity extends beyond a single lifetime. That connection to ancestors is crucial. Later Shang evidence makes clear that royal power is deeply entangled with communication between living rulers and deceased members of the royal lineage. Ancestors are not remembered passively. They are treated as beings capable of influencing harvests, warfare, childbirth, weather, illness, and royal fortune. Ritual offerings therefore serve political as well as spiritual purposes. The king occupies a privileged position as mediator between the human community and powerful ancestral forces. Bronze vessels help make that mediation tangible. During feasts and sacrifices, meat and alcohol are not merely consumed, they are transformed into offerings that reinforce hierarchy. Elite participants gather in carefully controlled settings. Valuable animals are slaughtered. Food is prepared in impressive vessels. Ancestors receive offerings. Living followers witness the ruler performing the ritual. Material abundance, spiritual authority, and political loyalty converge in the same ceremony. The scale of later Shang bronzes shows how far this system can develop. Some vessels weigh hundreds of kilograms and require enormous amounts of metal. Casting such objects is a major logistical operation. Multiple crucibles may have to be poured in coordinated sequence. Mold sections must remain stable under intense heat. A single error can destroy weeks or months of preparation. Producing such objects repeatedly implies not only technical mastery, but institutions capable of supporting highly organized teams. Weapons form another side of the bronze economy. Axes, dagger axes, spearheads, arrowheads, and other military equipment become increasingly common. Bronze does not replace stone immediately, nor does every soldier carry expensive metal weapons. But elite warfare increasingly depends on metallurgical production. Certain large axes may function as symbols of command or instruments of execution as much as practical battlefield weapons. Their size and decoration suggest that military authority and ritual authority are closely connected. This relationship becomes particularly important because early Shang power appears expansionist. Archaeological evidence shows Shang-related material appearing across extensive regions, and later written records describe frequent warfare against neighboring groups. Conquest supplies tribute, livestock, captives, and perhaps access to mines or trade routes. Successful warfare therefore feeds the bronze system, while the bronze system strengthens warfare in return. Human sacrifice may also be tied to these conflicts. At later Shang centers, many sacrificial victims appear to be outsiders or war captives, sometimes buried in groups without the treatment afforded elite dead. Their deaths become part of state ritual. The practice is difficult to confront because the same society capable of remarkable artistry and technical ingenuity also uses organized killing on a significant scale. Civilization does not automatically mean greater compassion. In some cases, increasing political complexity gives rulers more resources with which to institutionalize violence. Animal sacrifice operates on an equally impressive scale. Cattle, sheep, pigs, dogs, and horses are killed in ritual contexts. The economic cost is substantial. A healthy cow represents years of feeding and care, yet elite ceremonies can remove such animals from productive use. This apparent waste is precisely what makes the sacrifice powerful. Destroying valuable resources demonstrates that the ruling house possesses enough surplus to give them away to the ancestors. Alcohol may play an important role as well. Some bronze vessel forms are specifically associated with fermented beverages, and residue studies suggest that ancient Chinese societies had long traditions of producing alcoholic drinks from grains and other ingredients. At elite gatherings, alcohol could reinforce social bonds and ritual intensity. though the details remain uncertain. Later traditions sometimes portray excessive drinking as a sign of Shang moral decline, but those accounts are shaped by Zhou political ideology and cannot be accepted uncritically. What survives in the material record instead shows a society in which bronze, food, sacrifice, warfare, and ancestry are woven together. The state is not maintained by administration alone. It is maintained by performances of power that tell people where they stand in the human and supernatural order. And to sustain those performances, the Shang need cities capable of producing on a scale far beyond ordinary settlements. Beneath the soil of the Yellow River Basin, the remains of those cities still preserve foundries, walls, roads, graves, and workshops, the industrial skeleton of an early civilization whose rulers are becoming more powerful with every generation. Much of the early Shang world survives in fragments beneath later cities, farms, roads, and layers of accumulated earth. The great centers were not preserved as standing ruins. Their wooden buildings decayed, their walls eroded, their streets disappeared beneath sediment, and later generations built over them without knowing what lay below. What archaeologists recover today are foundations, compacted floors, post holes, workshop debris, graves, drains, pits, and buried sections of rammed earth walls. These traces can appear modest when viewed individually, yet together they reveal cities of startling scale. Yangshao is one of the clearest examples. The Bronze Age settlement lies beneath a modern urban landscape, making excavation difficult and incomplete. Even so, archaeologists have identified a massive inner enclosure surrounded by walls built from tightly compacted earth. Beyond those walls stretched additional neighborhoods and industrial zones, meaning the actual inhabited area was considerably larger than the fortified core. The city was not simply a palace surrounded by a wall. It was an extensive urban system containing elite compounds, ordinary residences, workshops, storage pits, cemeteries, and areas where raw materials were transformed into objects needed by the state. The walls themselves are among the most impressive surviving features. Their construction required repeated layers of earth to be compressed inside wooden frameworks until thick defensive barriers emerged. In places, the remains indicate walls of enormous width. Thousands of laborers would have been needed, not only to build them but to gather soil, transport it, feed workers, coordinate shifts, and maintain the construction process. A wall therefore represents more than military defense. It is evidence of administration. Outside the central enclosure, industrial districts reveal how specialized the urban economy had become. Bronze casting workshops produced ritual vessels and weapons. Pottery kilns supplied both ordinary and ceremonial ceramics. Bone-working areas processed animal remains into tools, hairpins, arrowheads, and other objects. The concentration of these activities into particular neighborhoods suggests deliberate organization, smoke, heat, noise, waste, and fire risk made certain crafts unsuitable for elite compounds. But political control may also have helped determine where specialists lived and worked. At some workshop sites, debris preserves the manufacturing process in unusually direct form. Broken molds, crucibles, slag, miscast fragments, animal bones, and discarded raw material expose the ordinary failures behind objects that later appear flawless in museums. Bronze casting was not magical precision. It involved experimentation, waste, and mistakes. A beautifully finished vessel might survive for 3,000 years, while the dozens of broken molds and failed castings that made it possible were dumped into pits and forgotten. That waste is archaeologically invaluable. Finished elite objects often move far from the workshops that produced them, especially when buried with powerful individuals. Production debris stays behind. It tells archaeologists where craftspeople actually worked and, indirectly, how rulers organized labor. Another major early center lies at Yanshi, not far from Erlitou. Its position makes it particularly important for understanding the political transition between the Erlitou and Shang worlds. Archaeologists uncovered a large walled settlement with carefully planned internal divisions, substantial buildings, roads, drainage systems, storage facilities, and workshop areas. The chronology places its development close to the period when Erlitou is declining, raising the possibility that Yanshi formed part of a new political order established near an older center of power. The relationship remains debated. Some scholars interpret Yanshi as an early Shang city intentionally placed to dominate or replace Erlitou. Others caution that the political sequence may have been more complicated. Archaeological cultures do not always correspond neatly to competing dynasties, and the existence of nearby centers does not prove a single dramatic conquest. What survives in the record suggests a major restructuring of regional power, but the exact events remain unknown. Yanshi nevertheless reveals an extraordinary level of planning. Walls divide space, gates regulate movement. Large building foundations occupy privileged positions. Drainage channels demonstrate concern with controlling water within the settlement. Storage pits indicate the accumulation of food or goods. The city appears to have been designed according to political priorities rather than simply expanding house by house. This ability to organize space becomes one of the enduring features of Chinese urban tradition. Later capitals are laid out with increasingly formal axes, gates, palace zones, ritual areas, workshops, and residential districts. The early Shang cities do not yet follow every principle seen in later imperial planning, but the basic idea is already present. A city can embody political hierarchy. Burials beneath and around these centers add another dimension. Some graves contain elaborate bronze objects, weapons, jade, and ceremonial goods, while others are far simpler. Human sacrifice appears in certain contexts, sometimes associated with elite architecture or tombs. Dogs are also buried in ritual pits, a practice found repeatedly in Shang archaeology. These deposits suggest that important buildings and political spaces could be sanctified through acts that joined construction with ritual. The abandoned areas are equally revealing. Cities change internally over time. Buildings are demolished. Workshops relocate. Roads are resurfaced. Pits are filled with refuse. Sections of a settlement lose importance while others expand. This constant rebuilding makes it dangerous to imagine an ancient city as a single frozen floor. Yangshao and Yanshi were living places, altered by generations who inherited structures they did not always preserve. Their populations would also have experienced the city very differently depending on status. An elite household might occupy a large compound near ceremonial centers. A craft specialist might live beside furnaces and production waste. Laborers and farmers could move between urban neighborhoods and surrounding fields. Captives might enter the city under entirely different conditions, as workers, servants, or sacrificial victims. Urbanism brought people together physically while reinforcing sharp distinctions between them. The scale of these centers shows that early Chinese civilization has now crossed a major threshold. Political authority can command large workforces, regulate valuable industries, defend strategic spaces, store surplus, and maintain networks linking cities with surrounding settlements. Yet these cities remain only partly visible to us because they left no extensive contemporary written histories. That changes farther north at another Shang center beside the Huan River. There, at Anyang, the dead kings, sacrificial pits, palace foundations, workshops, and thousands of inscribed bones finally allow the Shang world to speak in its own words. At Anyang, the Shang world becomes suddenly more intimate. Earlier cities reveal power through walls, workshops, roads, and graves. But here the archaeological record begins to preserve the concerns of rulers in extraordinary detail. The site, centered around the ancient settlement often called Yinshu, develops along the Huan River during the late 2nd millennium BCE. It is not simply another large city. It is the place where royal tombs, palace foundations, craft districts, sacrificial pits, chariot burials, and thousands of inscribed oracle bones come together, allowing the political world of the Shang kings to emerge with a clarity rarely possible for such an early period. Anyang does not resemble a compact-walled capital in the same way Zhengzhou does. Instead, settlement spreads across a broader landscape containing palatial zones, cemeteries, workshops, residential areas, and ritual spaces. Power is distributed through a network of elite compounds and production centers, rather than contained inside one enormous enclosure. This difference may reflect changes in political organization, military conditions, or the way the royal court used the surrounding landscape. Scholars still debate the exact extent of the urban area and how permanently different sectors were occupied, but what survives suggests a political center of remarkable scale. The palace and temple foundations at Xiaotun form one of the most important parts of the site. Large rammed earth platforms once supported wooden halls that have long disappeared. Post holes reveal rows of structural supports. Courtyards and building alignments suggest formal ceremonial spaces. Nearby pits contain sacrificial remains, including humans and animals, indicating that royal ritual was woven directly into the architecture of government. These were places where political decisions, ancestral ceremonies, and royal display may have occurred within the same physical environment. Beyond the palatial zone lie the royal cemeteries. Some tombs are enormous, cut deep into the earth with ramps descending towards central burial chambers. Their construction requires substantial labor even before the burial takes place. Soil must be removed, timber prepared, chambers reinforced, objects assembled, sacrificial victims selected, and ceremonies coordinated. A royal death therefore becomes a state project. Many of the largest tombs were robbed in antiquity, but surviving evidence reveals extraordinary wealth. Bronze vessels, weapons, jade objects, bone carvings, ornaments, chariots, horses, and sacrificed humans accompanied elite burials. Some tombs contain dozens or even hundreds of victims. These individuals may have included attendants, captives, guards, servants, or people selected for ritual purposes. Their identities are not always recoverable. What is unmistakable is that Shang kings could command life and death on a scale far beyond ordinary households. One of the most famous exceptions to ancient tomb robbery is the burial of Fu Hao, discovered intact in the 20th century. She was a high-status royal woman associated with the reign of King Wu Ding, and oracle bone inscriptions indicate that she held unusual authority. She participated in ritual activities and appears to have been connected with military campaigns. Her tomb contained hundreds of bronze, jade, bone, and stone objects, including weapons, ritual vessels, mirrors, ornaments, and cowrie shells. Fu Hao is important because she complicates simple assumptions about gender and power in the Shang court. Women clearly lived within a strongly hierarchical and patriarchal political system, yet at least some elite women could hold substantial ritual, economic and possibly military authority. Her case should not be treated as typical of all Shang women, but it demonstrates that royal status could create forms of power unavailable to most of the population. Chariots provide another striking clue to the changing world of late Shang warfare. Burials at Anyang preserve wooden vehicles whose organic components survive mostly as stains, impressions, and fittings, but enough remains to reconstruct their basic form. Horses were buried beside them, sometimes together with human attendants. Chariot technology appears in China during the 2nd millennium BCE and may ultimately reflect connections across the Eurasian steppe, though the precise routes and mechanisms of transmission remain debated. The Shang adapt the chariot rapidly to local warfare and elite display. A team of horses pulling a light vehicle can carry an elite warrior, driver, and sometimes another combatant. Chariots may have been useful for command, mobility, archery, and prestige rather than functioning like later mass cavalry. Their importance also lies in what they require. Horses must be bred, trained, fed, and managed. Wheels and axles require skilled woodworking. Bronze fittings must be cast. Roads and open terrain influence their usefulness. A chariot is therefore another concentrated expression of elite resources. The workshops around Anyang show how those resources are produced. Bronze foundries operate at a scale capable of supplying the royal court with huge quantities of ritual vessels and weapons. Bone workshops process cattle scapulae and other animal remains. Jade workers shape exceptionally hard stone using abrasive techniques that demand patience and precision. Potters produce both everyday vessels and specialized forms. Some neighborhoods appear associated with particular craft groups, suggesting that the royal center deliberately organizes specialist communities. Cowrie shells found in elite contexts reveal another surprising network. Many originate far from inland Henan, and they appear to have functioned as prestigious objects and perhaps as units of value in certain transactions. Their presence demonstrates that the Shang court participates in exchange systems extending well beyond the immediate Yellow River basin. The capital draws in metals, shells, livestock, stone, tribute, captives, and specialized goods from an enormous surrounding world. Warfare is one of the main ways those resources move. The Shang kings conduct repeated campaigns against neighboring groups. Some enemies are named in inscriptions, though connecting these names directly with specific archaeological cultures remains difficult. Armies seize captives, secure territory, defend allies, punish rivals, and perhaps protect access to important resources. The political landscape is not a stable empire with sharply marked borders. It is a shifting network of royal domains, allied settlements, subordinate leaders, and hostile groups. This instability helps explain the intensity of ritual. Shang rulers do not appear to assume that victory, harvest, rainfall, or childbirth will occur automatically. Each outcome is uncertain. Ancestors and supernatural powers must be consulted. Sacrifices must be timed correctly. Campaigns must be approved. Hunting expeditions, royal illnesses, and even dreams can become matters of political concern. At Anyang, that concern produces one of the most important archaeological discoveries in East Asian history. Thousands of cattle, shoulder blades, and turtle shells are carefully prepared, heated until they crack, interpreted by specialists, and sometimes inscribed with records of the questions put before ancestral powers. For the first time, the civilization along the Yellow River does not merely leave objects behind, it begins to write. The first surviving voices of the Shang do not come from books, monuments, or long inscriptions carved for posterity. They come from pieces of animal bone and turtle shell that were heated until they cracked. To modern eyes, these objects can seem almost accidental, fragile scraps rescued from pits beneath Anyang. Yet they preserve one of the great turning points in Chinese history. For the first time, the rulers of the Yellow River world leave behind extensive written records created during their own lifetime, and those records transform archaeology from a study of silent objects into something far more immediate. The materials are usually cattle shoulder blades and turtle plastrons. They are carefully prepared before use. Hollows are carved into the back, creating controlled points where heat can produce cracks. A diviner applies a heated tool, and the resulting fracture patterns are interpreted as signs. In many cases, scribes record what is being asked, sometimes who performed the divination, and occasionally what eventually happened. These inscriptions are what modern scholars call oracle bone writing. The writing is already sophisticated. It is not a primitive collection of a few marks slowly becoming language. The inscriptions use a developed system containing recognizable ancestors of many later Chinese characters. Some signs represent words directly, while others combine semantic and phonetic elements in ways that anticipate features of later Chinese writing. This maturity means the origins of the script must reach further back than the surviving Anyang inscriptions. Earlier symbols and possible writing have been found at several sites, but scholars still debate which examples represent full language rather than marks of ownership. Ritual signs, or simple notation. That missing earlier stage is one of the great unresolved problems of Chinese archaeology. Writing almost certainly did not appear suddenly in complete form at Anyang. It must have developed through earlier experiments, perhaps on materials that rarely survive. Bamboo, wood, leather, and other organic surfaces could have carried writing long before oracle bones became abundant, yet they decay easily in the soils of northern China. The evidence remains incomplete, and the archaeological silence may tell us more about preservation than invention. What survives at Anyang, however, is extraordinary. The inscriptions record royal concerns with harvests, rainfall, warfare, hunting, illness, childbirth, sacrifice, ancestral favor, dreams, weather, and political events. A king may seek guidance before launching a military campaign, ask whether rain will fall, investigate the cause of sickness, or determine which ancestor should receive an offering. The subjects move from affairs of state to matters that appear intensely personal, revealing how little separation exists between politics, family, religion, and the supernatural. The Shang king is not merely an administrator. He stands at the center of a ritual system in which ancestors are active political forces. Deceased rulers and royal relatives are believed capable of influencing events among the living. A failed harvest may reflect ancestral displeasure. A military victory may require ancestral support. Illness may be attributed to supernatural causes. The royal lineage therefore governs across generations, with the living king dependent on relationships with the dead. Divination allows those relationships to be managed. Questions are framed in ways that often present paired possibilities, and cracks are interpreted as favorable or unfavorable indications. Animals may then be sacrificed, ceremonies conducted, or plans altered. The system should not be imagined as random superstition operating outside politics. Within Shang society, divination is part of political decision-making itself. The king's ability to consult ancestors strengthens his unique position because access to supernatural knowledge is concentrated near the royal court. This creates an unusual written archive. Unlike later historical chronicles, oracle bones are not designed to explain Shang civilization to future readers. They record specific acts performed for immediate ritual purposes. Because of that, they contain gaps modern historians might find frustrating. They rarely describe institutions systematically. They assume knowledge that contemporary participants already possess. Names appear without explanation. Places are mentioned without maps. Battles may be noted without narratives of why they began. Yet precisely because they were not written as later propaganda, they provide a remarkable window into daily royal concerns. Names of kings found on the bones correspond closely with royal genealogies preserved in texts written centuries later. This convergence was crucial in confirming that the late Shang dynasty was not merely a later legend. Before the discovery and decipherment of the Anyang inscriptions, some historians had questioned how much confidence could be placed in ancient king lists. The oracle bones demonstrated that many of those names had genuinely existed in the 2nd millennium BCE. The story of their modern rediscovery is itself strange. In the late 19th century, inscribed bones reportedly circulated through Chinese medicinal markets as so-called dragon bones, fossil material ground for traditional remedies. Scholars began noticing that some fragments carried ancient symbols. Soon collectors and antiquarians sought them in large numbers, often without accurate records of where they'd been excavated. This early trade destroyed valuable archaeological context. But it also drew attention to the source region near Anyang and eventually led to systematic excavations. Tens of thousands of fragments have since been recovered, and researchers continue fitting broken pieces together, identifying individual scribal styles, reconstructing divination sequences, and refining the chronology of Shang reigns. Some fragments once separated across collections can be recognized as parts of the same original bone. The work is painstaking because each small inscription may contain only a few characters, yet together the fragments form an archive produced across generations. They also expose the intensity of Shang ritual life. Divination could occur repeatedly around the same problem. A campaign might generate several consultations. Questions about weather could be asked on successive days. Sacrificial schedules linked particular ancestors to particular offerings. The court appears to maintain an elaborate ritual calendar requiring animals, labor, specialist knowledge, and constant attention. Warfare appears frequently. The inscriptions mention campaigns against named groups, mobilization of forces, enemy attacks, captives, and royal hunting expeditions that may also have served as military training and demonstrations of power. Numbers sometimes suggest substantial forces, although interpreting ancient numerical statements requires caution. The Shang political landscape remains fragmented enough that the king must repeatedly fight to maintain influence. Agriculture is equally prominent because royal power ultimately depends on harvests. Millet and other crops feed the court, workers, soldiers, animals, and ritual gatherings. Rainfall is therefore not merely weather. It is a political concern significant enough to bring before the ancestors. A drought can weaken the entire system. Excessive rain can be equally destructive. Even childbirth becomes a matter of divination. Inscriptions connected with royal pregnancies reveal concern over successful delivery and the sex or fortune of children. These details bring the distant Shang court surprisingly close. Behind the monumental tombs and gigantic bronzes are families anxious about illness, birth, weather, and uncertainty. But the oracle bones speak mostly from the viewpoint of those near power. Kings, royal relatives, ritual specialists, military leaders, and ancestors dominate the written record. The millions of acts of labor that sustain the state are largely silent. To understand the civilization fully, it is necessary to move away from the bones and palaces and into the fields, workshops, kitchens, construction sites, military camps, and sacrificial pits where ordinary people experience Shang power from below. The grandeur of the Shang world depends on people who almost never appear by name. Beyond the palace compounds and royal cemeteries, most inhabitants live lives defined by work, season, obligation, and hierarchy. Farmers sow millet across the dry northern plains. Herdsmen manage pigs, cattle, sheep, and dogs. Potters tend kilns. Bronze workers handle furnaces hot enough to make the air almost unbreathable. Carpenters shape timber for halls, coffins, carts, and chariots. Bone workers cut and polish animal remains into tools and ornaments. Labourers haul earth for foundations and defensive works. Soldiers march beyond the political centre. Captives arrive from campaigns and may disappear into workshops, households, construction crews, or sacrificial pits. The state is visible through kings and bronzes, but its actual substance is human labour. Agriculture remains the base of everything. Millet is particularly important in the Yellow River region because it grows well in relatively dry conditions and has supported northern Chinese farming communities for thousands of years. Wheat, introduced earlier from Western Eurasia, is also present, though its role varies across regions and periods. Rice reaches the north through exchange and agricultural interaction with southern China, but it remains less central than in the Yangtze basin. The resulting food system is diverse, yet vulnerable. Harvests depend on rainfall patterns, local soils, labor availability, and storage. A poor year affects not only village households, but the entire structure of elite power. Most agricultural work is seasonal and relentless. Fields must be prepared before planting, weeds controlled, crops harvested quickly before weather or animals destroy them, grain dried, threshed, and stored. Pigs require feed, cattle require space. Tools break and must be repaired. Houses must be maintained. Fuel has to be gathered before winter. None of these tasks leaves behind impressive monuments, yet together they make possible every palace, tomb, and ritual feast. The organization of food also reveals political inequality. Elite households consume more meat and have greater access to animals used in ceremonial contexts. Ordinary people may rely far more heavily on grains, vegetables, gathered foods, and small quantities of animal protein. Archaeological studies of human bones sometimes show differences in diet between groups living within the same broad society. Such evidence must be interpreted carefully because diet varies with age, occupation, migration, and local custom, but it supports the wider picture of uneven access to resources. Craft specialists occupy another important layer of society. At large Shang centers, workshops appear to be highly organized and, in some cases, closely connected with elite compounds. Bronze casting requires teams rather than isolated individual craftsmen. Some workers prepare molds, others manage furnaces, others melt metal, handle crucibles, finish cast surfaces, or repair defects. Production debris suggests repetition and standardization. Certain vessel types are made again and again according to established forms, indicating that knowledge is transmitted within specialist communities. Those communities may have been organized through kinship, hereditary occupation, or direct royal supervision. The exact system remains uncertain. Later Chinese societies sometimes associated particular lineages with specialized crafts, and it is possible that similar arrangements existed earlier. But archaeology cannot always distinguish a family workshop from a state-controlled production group. What survives in the record suggests that skilled labor is concentrated and managed rather than randomly distributed. Bronze workers may have enjoyed higher status than ordinary agricultural laborers because their knowledge was rare, but their lives were hardly luxurious by default. Furnaces produce intense heat and smoke. Metalworking exposes workers to toxic materials. Repeated heavy labor leaves physical traces on bones. The beauty of a finished ritual vessel conceals an environment of heat, ash, broken clay, sharp tools, and industrial waste. Bone workers face a different world. Large quantities of cattle bones, antler and other animal remains are processed into hairpins, arrowheads, tools, handles, ornaments, and ritual objects. Workshops at Anyang contain enormous amounts of discarded material. The scale suggests systematic acquisition of animal remains from slaughter and sacrifice. Nothing valuable is necessarily wasted. A cow may provide meat, hide, tendon, horn, bone, and eventually a shoulder blade used for divination. Women participate throughout this economy, although the archaeological record often makes their labor difficult to separate from that of men. They likely engage in agriculture, food processing, textile production, household management, ritual preparation, and craft work. Depending on status and community, elite women can possess remarkable authority, as Fu Hao demonstrates, but most women leave no individual record. Textile production in particular would have demanded enormous time. From preparing fibers to spinning thread and weaving cloth. Because textiles rarely survive, this labor is greatly underrepresented in the archaeological record despite its everyday importance. Children also belong to this social world, although their experiences are even more difficult to reconstruct. Childhood in a Bronze Age agricultural society likely involves early participation in household work, learning through observation and repetition. Mortality is high by modern standards. Many children never reach adulthood, and infant or juvenile burials appear throughout archaeological sites. Their presence reminds us that population growth is not simply the result of high birth rates, but of communities repeatedly enduring losses that would be devastating by modern standards. At the opposite extreme of Shang society stand people who may have possessed almost no control over their fate. Captives taken during warfare appear repeatedly in oracle bone inscriptions and archaeological contexts. Some are sacrificed in large numbers. Others may be incorporated as laborers or dependents. Terms used in inscriptions are difficult to map neatly onto modern categories such as slave, prisoner, servant, or subject, so scholars still debate the precise status of many groups. What is clear is that coercive labor and forced movement form part of the political economy. Human sacrifice exposes this inequality most starkly. At Anyang, sacrificial pits contain individuals buried without elaborate goods, sometimes decapitated or dismembered. Some are placed beneath buildings or beside royal tombs. Others appear in groups associated with large ceremonies. Isotopic studies of human remains have provided evidence that at least some victims originated outside the immediate Anyang area, supporting the interpretation that war captives were among those sacrificed. Yet not every sacrificial victim fits the same pattern. Some individuals buried near elite tombs may have been attendants or retainers connected to royal households. Others could have been selected from dependent populations. No single explanation fully accounts for the variety of burials. The Shang ritual system appears to classify people differently, assigning distinct forms of death and burial according to status, origin, and ceremonial purpose. The ordinary population also experiences the state through warfare. Armies require men, provisions, weapons, transport, and animals. A campaign removes workers from fields and consumes stored grain. Victory can bring cattle, captives, territory, and prestige. But defeat can expose communities to raids and political instability. For rulers, warfare is recorded as strategy and divination. For villagers, it may mean absent family members, requisitioned food, and the arrival of enemies. Despite all of this, the Shang world should not be imagined only as suffering under elite domination. Communities also benefit from regional exchange, craft specialization, shared ritual traditions, and the security that powerful political centers can sometimes provide. Markets and distribution networks bring materials unavailable locally. Large ceremonial gatherings reinforce identity. Agricultural knowledge accumulates. Technologies spread. Social complexity creates opportunities as well as exploitation. But its benefits are never distributed evenly. The civilization revealed by bronzes and oracle bones is therefore not simply the achievement of a royal court. It is a vast social structure supported by countless people whose voices do not survive in writing. Their fingerprints remain on pottery, their muscles in walls, their diets in bones, their injuries in skeletons, their ashes around furnaces, and sometimes their bodies beneath the foundations of buildings built to outlast them. This unequal world can appear immensely stable when viewed through the scale of a Yang. Royal ancestors are honored generation after generation. Workshops continue producing bronzes. Armies campaign. Divination records the concerns of kings. Yet no political order is permanent. Far to the west, another power is growing, and when it finally moves against the Shang, it will not merely replace one ruling house with another. It will reshape the memory of everything that came before. By the final centuries of Shang rule, the political world centered on Anyang is powerful, wealthy, and deeply ritualized. Yet it is also under constant pressure. The king commands armies, oversees sacrifices, receives tribute, maintains alliances, and presides over a court supported by extensive agricultural and craft networks. Bronze production reaches extraordinary levels. Oracle bone divination continues to record royal concerns. Elite tombs become more elaborate. From the perspective of the capital, the system appears formidable. But beyond the royal core, political authority is never absolute. Rival groups remain active. Subordinate leaders possess their own interests, and regions at the edges of Shang influence can shift allegiance. The same network that gives the king power also creates vulnerabilities. To the west, one of those rival powers grows steadily stronger. The people later known as the Zhou occupy territories in the Wei River Valley, where they develop their own political center while interacting with Shang civilization. They are not isolated outsiders confronting an unfamiliar culture. Archaeology and later tradition both suggest long periods of contact. Zhou elites adopt and adapt bronze ritual practices, participate in regional exchange, and exist within a broader political world already shaped by Shang institutions. Their eventual conquest is therefore not the collision of two completely separate civilizations. It is a struggle within a shared Bronze Age system. The final Shang ruler is traditionally known as Di Xin, later remembered in Zhou and post-Zhou texts as a cruel and decadent king. These accounts describe excess, violence, and moral corruption, creating a powerful contrast with the supposedly virtuous Zhou founders. Yet such stories must be treated cautiously. Victorious dynasties have strong reasons to portray defeated rulers as deserving their fate. The evidence from contemporary Shang inscriptions does not provide a detailed moral biography of Di Xin, and many of the most dramatic stories appear in sources written long after the conquest. This is where history and political memory begin to merge. The Zhou do not merely defeat the Shang militarily, they also need to explain why their conquest is legitimate. Over time, this explanation becomes associated with the idea that supreme authority can be withdrawn from an immoral ruler and transferred to a more virtuous house. Later generations call this the mandate of heaven. The concept develops more fully during Zhou rule, but its political usefulness is obvious from the beginning. Conquest becomes not simple rebellion, but the restoration of cosmic and moral order. The decisive conflict traditionally culminates in the Battle of Muye, usually placed around the middle of the 11th century BCE. Exact chronology has been the subject of long debate, but the broad historical reality of a Zhou overthrow of the Shang is well established. Later texts describe a rapid collapse in which Shang forces are defeated and the final king dies soon afterward. Archaeology cannot reconstruct the battle in detail, and the numbers reported by later sources are almost certainly shaped by literary tradition. Still, the fall of the royal house at Anyang marks a genuine political turning point. The speed of the conquest may seem surprising given the apparent strength of the Shang, but large political systems can be fragile when their authority depends on personal alliances and regional loyalty. The Shang king does not govern through a bureaucratic apparatus comparable to later imperial China. His power is embedded in kinship, tribute, ritual relationships, warfare, and negotiated control over subordinate groups. If important allies defect, armies are stretched thin, or rival leaders cooperate against the center, a seemingly powerful state can unravel quickly. There are hints that Shang rulers were engaged in campaigns elsewhere shortly before the Zhou attack, though the details remain debated. Later traditions suggest that Zhou leaders built alliances among multiple groups dissatisfied with Shang rule. If so, the conquest may have succeeded not because the Zhou were overwhelmingly stronger, but because they struck when the political network supporting the Shang had become vulnerable. Yet the Shang do not simply disappear after defeat. This is one of the most important corrections archaeology makes to traditional narratives of dynastic replacement. Populations remain in place. Craftspeople continue working. Ritual practices survive. Bronze styles influence Zhou production. Former Shang elites are incorporated into the new order. Some lineages retain status under Zhou supervision. The new rulers inherit an enormous cultural and technological foundation rather than replacing it. The Zhou even preserve parts of the Shang ancestral tradition. Descendants of the defeated royal house are granted territories where they can continue certain ritual obligations. This is politically useful. By allowing former elites a controlled place within the new system, the Zhou reduce resistance while presenting themselves as legitimate successors rather than destroyers of the old world. Bronze inscriptions become increasingly important during this transition. Unlike the short divinatory texts on oracle bones, Zhou bronze inscriptions can commemorate appointments, military achievements, gifts, land grants, and political relationships. These inscriptions preserve a changing style of authority. The ruler remains central, but written records increasingly document obligations between the royal house and elite lineages. Political power is becoming more explicitly articulated through inherited titles, grants, and ritual hierarchy. At the same time, the Zhou reshape the remembered past. The Shang become one dynasty in a larger sequence. Before them comes the Xia. Before Xia come culture heroes and legendary rulers associated with the creation of agriculture, ritual, social order, and flood control. History stretches backward into a moral landscape in which good government produces stability and corruption leads to collapse. This structure becomes enormously influential. It provides later Chinese thinkers with a way to understand political change. A dynasty does not fall because history is random. It falls because rulers fail, virtue declines, and legitimacy passes elsewhere. The model is elegant, but actual archaeological history is much messier. States decline because of combinations of warfare, resource pressure, factional struggle, changing alliances, demographic movement, environmental stress, and political miscalculation. Moral stories simplify these processes into lessons. The same simplification affects how the Xia is remembered. If Zhou rulers need a precedent showing that one dynasty can justly replace another, then a dynasty before the Shang becomes politically useful. The Xia may preserve genuine memories of an earlier political formation, perhaps related to Erlitou, but later narratives are shaped by the ideological needs of subsequent centuries. This makes the ancient sequence both historical and constructed at the same time. What survives in the archaeological record suggests continuity beneath political change. The technologies that define early Chinese civilization do not vanish with the Shang. Bronze casting continues. Rammed earth construction continues. Millet agriculture remains fundamental. Ancestor ritual persists. Writing survives and evolves. Urban planning becomes more formal. Elite lineages retain power. The Zhou inherit a world already transformed by many centuries of experimentation along the Yellow River. The conquest therefore marks an ending only at the level of one royal house. Beneath that change, the deeper civilization continues. And this is perhaps the most important clue to understanding what the Yellow River actually created. The earliest Chinese civilization is not the work of a single dynasty, a single king, or a single city. It is the cumulative result of villages becoming towns, towns becoming fortified centers, centers competing for labor and resources, rulers learning to control bronze and ritual, and generations turning local traditions into institutions durable enough to survive even the collapse of the people who first commanded them. By the time the Zhou inherit the political world created by the Shang, the Yellow River Basin has already undergone thousands of years of transformation. What began as a landscape of farming villages has become a region of fortified centers, planned cities, royal lineages, specialized industries, written administration, ritual institutions, and military competition. None of these developments appears suddenly, and none belongs exclusively to one dynasty. The civilization that emerges along the Yellow River is cumulative. It is assembled layer by layer from older practices, regional experiments, failed settlements, borrowed technologies, environmental pressures, and generations of political innovation. This is why the search for a single beginning is so difficult. If civilization is defined by cities, Erlitou becomes a compelling candidate. If writing is essential, the late Shang world at Anyang provides the first extensive surviving evidence. If dynastic tradition is emphasized, the Xia becomes important, though its archaeological identity remains uncertain, if organized hierarchy, fortification, and specialized production are enough. Then the roots reach further back into the Longshan period and beyond. Each definition produces a different starting point. Archaeology, therefore, resists the clean sequence preserved in later historical memory. The familiar progression from Xia to Shang to Zhou is useful, but beneath it lies a much more complicated landscape. Regional cultures rise and decline at different times. Technologies spread across political boundaries. Populations move. Rulers borrow from rivals. Religious practices are reshaped rather than invented from nothing. Even the political centers that appear dominant are surrounded by communities whose identities may never have matched the names preserved in later texts. The Yellow River itself reinforces this instability. No civilization here can treat geography as permanent. Channels migrate, floodplains expand, settlements are buried beneath sediment, agricultural zones shift. The river nourishes the very population growth that makes political complexity possible, yet it also threatens that complexity with sudden destruction. Later Chinese states will spend enormous resources attempting to control water, build embankments, organize canals, and repair flood damage, but the struggle is never completely won. The river remains a reminder that a political authority operates inside an environment it cannot fully command. The legacy of millet agriculture is equally profound. Small grains cultivated by Neolithic farmers sustain increasingly dense populations and create the surplus required for specialists, soldiers, rulers, and ritual institutions. Surplus allows cities to exist, but it also creates the possibility of taxation and inequality. Once grain can be stored, it can be controlled. Once it can be controlled, political authority can convert food into labor, a wall, palace, workshop. A royal tomb is therefore partly the transformation of thousands of harvests into architecture. Bronze adds another layer. The great ritual vessels of the Shang are among the most extraordinary achievements of ancient metallurgy. But their deeper significance lies in organization. Every vessel represents mining, transport, fuel, ceramic technology, skilled labor, food supply, and elite demand. The ability to concentrate all of these resources becomes a political technology in itself. The bronze object is simply the final visible product of an invisible social system. Writing changes that system again. With oracle bone inscriptions, political power acquires memory outside the human mind. Names can be preserved, divination can be recorded, military campaigns, sacrifices, ancestors, and agricultural concerns can be fixed in signs. The writing system that appears at Anyang is already complex enough to suggest a long earlier development, and its descendants will remain part of Chinese civilization for millennia. Scripts change dramatically over time, but the continuity between Shang writing and later Chinese characters is one of the most remarkable survivals from the Bronze Age. Ancestor ritual also proves extraordinarily durable. Shang kings organized political authority through relationships between living rulers and deceased members of the royal lineage. Later systems transform these practices, but reverence for ancestors, genealogical memory, ritual obligation, and the political power of a lineage remain important features of Chinese society. Once again, continuity does not mean that later traditions are identical to Shang religion. It means that institutions can survive by changing. Urban planning follows the same pattern. Erlitou organizes roads and elite compounds. Zhengzhou expands fortification and specialized industrial districts. Anyang distributes royal, craft, residential, and burial zones across a vast political landscape. Later Chinese capitals become increasingly formalized, with walls, gates, axes, palace districts, markets, temples, and administrative quarters arranged according to evolving political and cosmological principles. The earliest cities do not yet possess the complete form of later capitals, but they establish the principle that the organization of space can express hierarchy. Perhaps the most enduring political legacy is the idea that rulers must justify power through something larger than force alone. Shang kings derive authority partly through ancestral relationships and ritual performance. Zhou rulers reshape that system by presenting conquest as morally legitimate. The concept later known as the Mandate of Heaven becomes one of the most influential political ideas in Chinese history, allowing dynastic change to be interpreted as part of an ordered moral universe. Yet archaeology introduces a necessary tension into that neat story. Dynasties rarely fall simply because rulers become immoral. They fall through combinations of internal conflict, military defeat, weakened alliances, economic strain, demographic shifts, environmental pressure, and political miscalculation. The moral explanation is powerful because it makes history understandable. The archaeological explanation is messier because real societies are messy. That tension between memory and material evidence remains at the heart of the question of the Xia. Erlitou fits many expectations for an early state, and its location and chronology overlap intriguingly with later traditions. But without contemporary inscriptions identifying its rulers or polity, certainty remains impossible. Scholars still debate whether Erlitou should be directly equated with Xia, whether it represents only part of a larger Xia-related world, or whether the later dynasty represents memories assembled from several early political traditions. The uncertainty does not diminish the civilization. It enlarges the mystery. Whether its rulers called themselves Xia or something entirely lost, Erlitou proves that sophisticated state-level society existed in the Yellow River region before the securely documented late Shang kings. Longshan centers show that even Erlitou rests on older experiments in hierarchy and urbanism. Neolithic villages reveal that those experiments depend on millennia of agricultural and social development. The first Chinese civilization, then, is not a moment. It is a process. It begins wherever people along the Yellow River start transforming landscape into settlement, surplus into hierarchy, craft into specialization, ritual into authority, and memory into institutions capable of surviving the people who created them. The dynasties matter, but the deeper story lies beneath their names. Under fields, roads, modern cities, and layers of yellow earth, that earlier world still survives in fragments. A black pottery cup, a rammed earth foundation, a turquoise dragon, a broken bronze mold, a sacrificed animal beneath a building, a king's question scratched into bone. Taken separately, each fragment seems small. Together they describe the long construction of a civilization. The story can end where the archaeological record becomes clearest, but the river continues beyond every dynasty that claims it. The Yellow River moves through landscapes that have been inhabited, abandoned, cultivated, flooded, rebuilt, and remembered for thousands of years. Cities rise beside its tributaries and disappear beneath fields. Walls that once required armies of laborers become low lines of compressed earth. Palaces lose their roofs, their wooden columns rot, and their courtyards fill with dust. Bronze vessels remain underground while the names of the people who cast them vanish. Only fragments resist time. A farmer working soil above an ancient settlement may stand a few meters from the foundation of a palace without knowing it. Beneath modern roads lie older roads that once carried grain, bronze, animals, soldiers, and ritual processions. Beneath houses lie graves. Beneath graves may lie still earlier villages. The landscape becomes a stack of human decisions, each generation building over another. The people who lived along the early Yellow River could not know what would follow them. They did not know that later historians would arrange their rulers into dynasties, that archaeologists would debate the name Sia, or that marks scratched onto cattle bone would become evidence for one of the world's oldest surviving writing traditions. They lived inside immediate concerns: rain, harvest, family, illness, warfare, ritual, hunger, status, and survival. That is perhaps the quietest lesson left by their civilization. What later appears monumental begins as ordinary necessity. A city begins with stored grain. A dynasty begins with alliances. A writing system begins with marks made for reasons that seem urgent only to the people making them. A tradition becomes ancient only because enough generations continue carrying parts of it forward. The Yellow River never stops moving, and neither does the society around it. The earliest villages disappear, yet farming continues. Erlitou declines, yet bronze casting expands. The Shang fall, yet writing and ritual endure. The Zhou replace their kings, yet inherit much of the world those kings helped create. Across the plain, the river carries yellow sediment toward the sea, just as it did before the first walls were raised. Beneath that drifting earth rest the evidence of people who slowly built something larger than any single settlement or ruler. Not a civilization born in one instant, but one assembled over centuries, remembered imperfectly, buried repeatedly, and never entirely lost.